Hey, welcome to the Memorizing Pharmacology podcast. This is Over-the-Counter Pharmacology, Part 2, supporting the Memorizing Pharmacology, a Relaxed Approach series of books, including Memorizing Pharmacology Mnemonics. And in this section, we're going to go over the gastrointestinal and musculoskeletal medications over-the-counter, and then we'll get to the other categories: respiratory, immune, neuro, cardio, and endocrine. But here we go. Okay, let's start with calcium carbonate, or Tums. So we're going to pair each of these up so that you have a reference point. You really don't want to try to memorize things by themselves. It's a lot easier to remember two things together than it is to remember one alone. So what we'll pair calcium carbonate, or Tums, up with is magnesium hydroxide, milk of magnesia, and that'll come up in the next slide. So both of them are antacids. They work very quickly. A couple minutes, they should provide some relief. And they're receptorless. That just means that they go into your stomach and increase the pH, which sounds a little bit strange, but you're increasing the alkalinity and you're decreasing the acidity. But these drugs work very quickly because of that. The generic name and chemical name are the same. Calcium carbonate is the generic name. It's also the chemical name. And magnesium hydroxide is the chemical name. It is the generic name. Calcium is on the periodic table of elements under 20. And then just 8 away from it is magnesium. So that means they're right under each other. So calcium is right under magnesium. And they both have that +2 charge when ionized. So thinking about how we can remember them, well, Tums, I don't want to call it chalky, but it's definitely a tablet that kind of breaks apart. They come in fruit flavors. Sometimes there's a mint one. And just like on the periodic table of elements, you'll find them on the over-the-counter shelf right next to each other or above each other. So magnesium hydroxide, or milk of magnesia, as I said, is also an antacid. Its generic name and chemical name are the same. And on the periodic table of elements, magnesium is 12. What's important really is that when do we use Tums and when do we use milk of magnesia? Well, Tums, because of its calcium component, can also be used as a calcium supplement. Milk of magnesia, if you take enough of it, it has a bit of a laxative effect. So if you have constipation, milk of magnesia would be the right choice. If you want to help with calcium supplementation, calcium carbonate would be the choice. And then as an antacid, either one would be fine. But we're also introducing the idea of solid versus liquid preparations. Famotidine and ranitidine I'll put together as the next two. So famotidine is Pepcid, and it's an H2 blocker. What that means is that we have antihistamines, and technically it's an antihistamine. There's a histamine 1 and a histamine 2. And histamine 1, that's the allergies histamine. So we don't say H1 because when we discovered those, we didn't know there would ever be a 2. So antihistamines just talks about allergy antihistamines like Benadryl and Claritin and Zyrtec and Allegra and those types of things. But an H2 blocker, if you block histamine 2, you block the introduction of acid into the stomach. And we can recognize these by their stem. Now, there's a lot of misinformation on the internet about stems and suffixes and prefixes, and I'm not going to go into it too much into these slides. It's in the book. The whole book explains it. But I want you to know that tidine is an official stem. It comes from the original cimetidine. And they took the last 6 letters and said, okay, if you're going to introduce an H2 blocker as a manufacturer of these medications, you need to have tidine at the end of them. And this is helpful because this lets you know the 4 that are out there: cimetidine, famotidine, ranitidine, and nizatidine. by just knowing those 6 letters. The brand name, I think they did a pretty good job. You're not allowed to say exactly what it is, but peptic means digestive, and acid, obviously you're trying to reduce acid. So peptic plus acid makes Pepcid AC. Esomeprazole actually came after Omeprazole, but I'll explain why this one's first. So esomeprazole alphabetically, though, comes before omeprazole, and within a class I've tried to alphabetize them. So C before M, calcium before magnesium, F before R, famotidine before ranitidine, esomeprazole before omeprazole, and this will help with memorization. Now in the book I go over the 200 drugs, and my expectation is that by the end of the book you can memorize all 200 drugs in order. I've done it, and I know that you can do it as well. But in here I'm just keeping those pairings to make it easy to recognize which one should be on the shelf next to each other. So what is a proton pump inhibitor? Well, going back to our chemistry, proton is something that has to do with acidity. And if we stop protons from going into the stomach, we reduce that acidity. The stem is prazole, P-R-A-Z-O-L-E. So if something ends in prazole, it should be a proton pump inhibitor. Now there's an exception to this with some prescription items, antipsychotics that end with piprazole, P-I-P-R-A-Z-O-L-E. This was discouraged by the World Health Organization, and they still came out, I think, with a new piprazole. But for the most part, prazole, you should notice that it's a proton pump inhibitor. And then if you think of next, plus hydronium, so hydronium is the ionized form of this acid. That might be a way to remember it. And then next means that, well, Prilosec came first and Nexium came next, and they're the same thing. We can also look at the colors, though, and see that they're very similar. So you see a yellow background here with a purple pill, and then when we get to the next one, you'll see just a purple background in this purple pill. Maybe also easy to remember that. Okay. Omeprazole, this came first, and this is also a proton pump inhibitor. The stem is prazole, and I mentioned that before. And if you look at the brand name, you can think of protons, or the PR from protons, and then the LO for low, and then SEC for the word secretion. So protons low secretion, to remind you that it's a proton pump inhibitor, and it's going to help with secretion and hyperacidic conditions. So we've paired 2 antacids, 2 H2 blockers, 2 proton pump inhibitors. Next we're going to pair 2 antidiarrheals together. Bismuth subsalicylate is Pepto Bismol. Don't confuse that with Pepto Children's, which is just calcium carbonate or Tums. So the Sal, S-A-L, recognize that as a salicylate, and this is dangerous in children, especially if they have some kind of fever or chicken pox or something like that. We can have some kind of issue with Reye syndrome. So again, this is Pepto Bismol for adults. The stem is Sal. I mentioned that already. But the salicylate component, when we think of salicylates, we usually think of analgesia as an aspirin, acetylsalicylic acid. But in this case, we're really memorizing the Sal to remember one of the adverse effects or one of the contraindications that we shouldn't give it in children. If you look at the word Pepto-Bismol, you can think of peptic, which means digestive. You can think of bismuth as number 83 on the periodic table. It causes some darkening of the tongue, maybe of the stool, but this effect is harmless. The other antidiarrheal is loperamide, or Imodium, and this one doesn't really have a stem. There's nothing in it that says what it is, and amide is just a certain kind of chemical structure. But if you just think of the word peristalsis, peristalsis is that movement in your stomach, what gets things going. And if you think of it as low peristalsis, that might be a way to remember the generic. Loperamide is for lowering peristalsis or slowing it, okay, or slow peristalsis. And then the word Imodium, if you think of the word immobile, slowing things down, something that doesn't move, that might be helpful as well for memorization. The next medication, Docusate sodium, Colace. This is actually not really a laxative, it's more of a stool softener. It's going to bring a lot of water into the bowel, so a lot of times when we say take with water, we mean it's a horse pill or a large pill, and taking it with water would be helpful. In this case, it can really dehydrate the patient, so you want to really make sure the patient knows that they should take with water. If they even get to the pharmacist, again, this is over the counter, they could just pull it off the shelf and check out without any counseling. And then colon's pace. I know it doesn't exactly work in the colon, but if you think of Colace and slowing the colon's pace, or speeding the colon's pace, then maybe that would be a way to remember what Colace does. Polyethylene glycol, or Miralax. So this sort of has a stem. The stem for polyethylene glycol is PEG, P-E-G, and you can pull those letters out of the generic name. It's an osmotic laxative, so it's very safe. It can be used in children, and when I look at that brand name, I think it's a miracle laxative, or it's a miracle how good you feel after you've used this laxative, something like that. But the letters LAX for laxative are in there. This is the first of the musculoskeletal drugs, aspirin, and this is the regular analgesic strength aspirin, 325 milligrams. Its brand name is Ecotrin, and let me talk about non-steroidal, and then I'll talk about the name. So a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug is trying to compare it to maybe like a prednisone that is steroidal, and what we're saying is it's not that. So it's a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, and if you take the N, the S, the A, the I, and the D, you get NSAID. So it's pronounced for the first letter N, and then we just say the word SAID. If you really want to get into it, it's an initialism plus an acronym, the way that you would maybe say, like, I can't think of anything right now. But for example, ROTC, ROTC. ROTC is an initialism. ROTC is an acronym. But it's important that you not say NSAID. So a lot of people want to put an A after the N because N and S together, it just doesn't, normally you don't say that in the English language. So it's as if it were spelled ENSAID. ASA and acetylsalicylic acid. So these are different ways that we refer to aspirin. If you look at acetyl, salicylic, and acid, and you take the A, the S, and the A away, that's where we come up with the initialism ASA. And then the brand name comes from enteric-coated aspirin. So something that is enteric is going to go through the enteral system or the GI system. Something that is parenteral or parenteral is going to go outside the GI system. So what this is this is coated so that it doesn't hurt the stomach and can pass through to treat some kind of pain, fever, a couple other things that aspirin is good for. Ibuprofen or Motrin. This has a stem, the Profen stem, and there are some brand non-steroidals that also have that Profen stem. So again, this is also a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. It's similar to aspirin, but because it can be safely used in children, it certainly has its own niche. Just a reminder, if you're looking in the OTC aisles, you really do want to have a pharmacist with you, especially if you're looking for something for kids, because the adult Motrin is in a different place than the children's Motrin, and then children's and infants tend to be different when we're talking about these kinds of drugs. So an infant is someone under 2, and usually you have to have somebody specifically dosing that. And then a child is someone from 2 to 12, something like that. But anytime you're looking for Motrin for a child, you really should get some help. So again, I mentioned the stem is Profen, and then this just goes to visual literacy. Why is it that Motrin is this bright orange and then Advil is that blue? So if you look on the color wheel, those are exactly opposite each other. And I don't know who came first, the Motrin or the Advil, but somebody said, you know, I really want this to stand out, because if it looks just like it, then we're going to look just like we're the same thing. So to have something stand out the most, you just go opposite the color wheel. So again, this is kind of a tangent, but a way to remember that they're both related is that Motrin orange is opposite Advil blue on the color wheel. Okay. Ibuprofen or Advil, so the exact same generic drug. Advil is another brand name for the over-the-counter medication. And as I mentioned, the colors, just a way to remember that those are related in some way. Same thing, stem is Profen. And I always thought of Advil helping with the anvil. So in a lot of cartoons, you'll see an anvil fall on one of the characters and they get a headache. And Advil and anvil are only separated by one letter. So the way to remember that Advil is for that kind of pain is just think of that anvil falling on the character's head. So aspirin, ibuprofen, those really need to be taken up to 4 times a day. But the next medication, Naproxen, only needs to be taken probably like twice a day. And this is also a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. We see the endings are similar. Now, Proxen isn't an official stem, but Proxen and Profen only are separated by that one letter, and maybe that's a way that you can remember those are related as non-steroidals. When I think of the brand name, I think of Aleve and alleviating your pain. So that also maybe can help you remember this one. A drug that's talked about quite a bit with these non-steroidals is Tylenol. And this is acetaminophen, or paracetamol if you're coming from the UK. And the brand name is Tylenol. So this is a non-narcotic analgesic. Tylenol or acetaminophen is often paired with narcotics. So the brand name of Vicodin, a prescription drug, has hydrocodone, which is a narcotic, and acetaminophen, which is non-narcotic. So we're trying to define it, and we have to define it by what it's not. So just as aspirin, ibuprofen, naproxen are non-steroidals, non-steroids, acetaminophen is a non-narcotic. Okay? So it's a little like defining non-fiction by saying it's not fiction. Okay? So you're not really defining it, you're just saying what it's not. The name, or the short names, APAP or Tylenol, come from the chemical name N-acetyl-para-aminophenol. What good is N-acetyl-para-aminophenol? Well, if you're an organic chemist, you can draw it from just that description relatively easily. But you can see that we take the A from acetyl, the P from para, the A from amino, and the P from phenol. As far as Tylenol, they just took the TYL from the acetyl and the ENOL from the phenol to come up with that name. That's how we used to do it. But now, once you get a stem, then every drug coming after that should be similar. Okay. Acetaminophen, aspirin, and caffeine, Excedrin, migraine. I like this drug because it's a combination drug and kind of brings together a number of the drugs that we just talked about. So acetaminophen, a non-narcotic analgesic, that helps with the migraine pain. The aspirin, it helps with pain and inflammation. Acetaminophen doesn't help with the inflammatory process. So it's nice to have aspirin helping in that way. Why wouldn't you just use aspirin and just skip the acetaminophen altogether? There's a school of thought that if you have 2 medications and they do something similar, then hopefully you can reduce the dosage of both, and hopefully you'll keep below the adverse effect threshold of both. So the idea is that we don't have to do full 325 milligrams of aspirin. We don't have to do the full 500 milligrams of acetaminophen, or 650 for the extra strength. And that way maybe we can reduce the side effects. The caffeine seems a little bit weird. You want to be wide awake while you're having your headache? No. The idea is that maybe the headache is an issue of vasodilation, so a vessel in the brain opening up. Caffeine tends to constrict or narrow blood vessels. So the idea is that it's going to narrow the blood vessel in the brain and relieve that pain. So acetaminophen, the non-narcotic analgesic, the aspirin, the anti-inflammatory, and caffeine, a vasoconstrictor, all together working in concert to help get rid of migraine pain.